Theo Ramsey ordered his usual at Ren's Cafe on an ordinary
Here
Tuesday
you go,
morning.
keep the change.
The same order he had
Thank you very
placed
much,
nearly
sir.
every weekday for 15 years. A plain black coffee, medium, no cream, and reached for his wallet the way he had reached for it
This is
thousands
exactly
of
what I
times
needed.
before.
Best coffee in the
Already
city.
covered, Gus said, sliding the cup across the
I
counter.
have seen many people
exactly
sit
the
in
way
that
he
exact
always
chair.
did. Exactly the way
Did
every
any of them
barista
find
who
what
had
they were
ever
looking
worked the
for?
morning shift at Ren's
Some
had
did,
always done.
others
for
are
as
still
long as
searching.
Theo could remember. Theo laughed, the same easy,
Do you think
automatic
this rain
laugh
is
he gave
ever gonna
most
stop?
mornings in response to what he'd
It
always
does not
assumed
look like
was
it
some
today,
kind of loyalty
but
program.
at least we have
or
fresh
a rounding
coffee.
error the cafe simply didn't bother correcting, or perhaps a running joke among the staff that had outlived whoever originally started it. "You know this is my last week," Gus said, wiping down the counter, his voice carrying a specific weight that made Theo look up from his cup. 30 years behind this counter. I retire on Friday." "I didn't know it was this week," Theo said. Congratulations, Gus. Genuinely, you've earned it." Gus nodded, something working behind his expression that Theo couldn't quite place. "I've been thinking, the last few days, about all the things I've kept to myself over the years, working this counter. Things people ask you not to mention, and you just carry them, because that's part of the job." He paused, looking at Theo directly. "You know someone's been covering your coffee this whole time, right? Every single morning, for 15 years. Not the cafe, not some promotion, an actual person." Theo felt something in his chest go very still. "What are you talking about?" he asked slowly. Gus glanced toward the back of the cafe, toward a small corner table near the window, currently empty, that Theo realized, with a growing and specific unease, he had never once, in 15 years, seen unoccupied at this particular hour. "I probably shouldn't be the one to tell you this," Gus said, "but I'm leaving Friday, and I don't think it's right for something this important to just quietly retire along with me, without anyone ever explaining it to you directly." Theo looked down at the coffee cup in his hands, ordinary and unremarkable, the same cup he had held on thousands of mornings across 15 years without once, not a single time, thinking to ask who, exactly, had been quietly paying for it. Theo Ramsey was 43 years old, a high school counselor specializing in at-risk youth, married for 11 years to a steady, warm woman named Priya, father to 2 young children who knew almost nothing about the specific, difficult chapter of their father's life that had preceded their own existence by only a few years. 15 years earlier, Theo had been, by any reasonable measure, close to the very bottom of his own life. A struggle with alcohol that had started in his 20s had accelerated sharply following the end of a long relationship and the loss of his job within the same difficult year, and Theo had spent nearly 8 months, at his lowest point, without stable housing, sleeping some nights in his car, other nights on a rotating circuit of friends' couches that gradually, understandably, grew less available to him as his situation continued without visible improvement. Ren's Cafe had been, during that specific period, one of the few places Theo could reliably sit indoors during the coldest mornings, warm and unremarkable enough that nobody questioned his presence, quiet enough that he could simply exist there for an hour or two without the specific, exhausting vigilance that homelessness required in most other public spaces. He had, in the earliest months of that period, genuinely been unable to afford even the modest cost of the cafe's cheapest coffee some mornings, and had simply sat, empty-handed, at whatever table was available, until the specific shame of that emptiness had become its own kind of unbearable. He remembered, though he had never fully examined the memory with the attention it apparently deserved, that somewhere during that period the shame had simply stopped. He had begun receiving a cup of coffee each morning without paying for it, delivered with the same brisk, unremarkable efficiency as any other transaction, and he had assumed, in the specific fog of that difficult period, that the cafe had simply extended him some informal, unspoken grace, a policy perhaps applied to regulars who occasionally couldn't pay, nothing especially significant, simply one of the small mercies that had allowed him to continue existing through his worst months with slightly more dignity than he might otherwise have managed. He had entered a recovery program the following year, slowly rebuilt his stability, returned to school for a counseling degree, and had eventually built the life he now occupied. Married, employed, a father, a professional who spent his working days trying to extend, deliberately and consciously, the same kind of steady, unjudging presence to teenagers navigating their own versions of crisis that he had once, unknowingly, received from a café that had simply never made him feel like a burden during the worst period of his life. He had continued coming to Ren's every weekday morning, across all 15 of the intervening years, long after his circumstances had entirely changed, the ritual having become, without his ever fully examining why, one of the fixed, comforting anchors of his adult life, a specific, unbroken continuity connecting the man he'd once been to the man he had since become. He had never once, across 15 years and thousands of mornings, thought to ask why his coffee always seemed to already be paid for. "Her name is Beatrice Hollis," Gus said, once Theo had recovered enough composure to ask the obvious question. "She started coming in around the same time you did, all those years ago. I remember her noticing you, sitting for hours some mornings, not ordering anything, clearly struggling. She came up to the counter one day, quiet about it, and told my predecessor, old Marcus, to just add your order to her tab every morning, whatever you ask for, and never to tell you it was her. She's been doing it ever since. Every single day, even after you started dressing for that school job of yours, even after it became obvious you didn't need it anymore in the way you once did." Theo looked toward the empty corner table again, understanding, with a specific vertigo, that the table's emptiness at this particular moment was itself unusual, that some version of Beatrice Hollis had apparently been sitting there, quietly, at almost this exact hour, for 15 consecutive years, close enough to witness his own slow rebuilding without ever once stepping forward to claim any credit for the small, steady kindness she had extended throughout it. "Why hasn't she said anything?" Theo asked. "In 15 years, why keep it a secret this long, even after everything changed?" Gus considered this. "I asked her something similar, years ago," he said. "She told me she didn't want you to ever feel like you owed her anything. Said the moment gratitude enters something like this, it stops being a gift and starts being a transaction, and she didn't want that for you. I think, honestly, she also just liked doing it quietly. Some people are built that way. The doing matters more to them than being seen doing it." "Is she all right?" Theo asked, an instinct rising in him that he couldn't fully explain. "Health-wise, I mean." Gus's expression shifted, something more careful entering his voice. "She's had some trouble the past few months," he said. "Nothing I should probably be the one telling you the specifics of, but she's slowed down considerably. Misses more mornings than she used to. I think that's part of why I decided to finally tell you, if I'm honest. I didn't want this to just quietly end someday, with neither of you ever having had the chance to actually know each other." Theo did not approach Beatrice for nearly 2 weeks. He told himself, during those days, that he was simply respecting the specific anonymity she had apparently valued enough to maintain across 15 years, that showing up suddenly, armed with gratitude she had never asked for, might feel more like an intrusion than a kindness, disrupting an arrangement she had clearly built with deliberate, careful boundaries. This explanation held up reasonably well for the first several days. After that, he recognized, with a discomfort that felt increasingly familiar, that he was doing something considerably closer to avoidance than respect, the specific, comfortable distance of telling himself that not acting was somehow more considerate than the harder, more vulnerable work of actually approaching someone directly. He recognized this pattern, uncomfortably, because he had been practicing a version of it in his own professional life for months, with a particular student, Marisol Reyes, a 16-year-old he counseled, who had been showing increasingly visible signs of instability at home. Missed classes, a specific withdrawn quality that had worsened steadily over the semester. Small details that Theo had noticed and documented carefully in his professional notes, without ever quite crossing the line into the kind of direct, sustained intervention he suspected the situation genuinely required. He told himself, with Marisol, that he was respecting appropriate professional boundaries, that pushing too hard risked damaging the fragile trust he'd built with her, that his role was to remain a steady, available presence rather than to force a confrontation she wasn't ready for. His wife, Priya, Listening to him describe Beatrice's situation over dinner one evening made the connection before Theo had fully articulated it himself. "That sounds a lot like how you talk about Marisol," she said carefully. "This idea that staying at a careful distance is somehow the more respectful choice. I understand the instinct, but I think there's a difference between giving someone space and simply protecting yourself from the discomfort of getting more directly involved." Theo sat with this observation longer than he wanted to admit, recognizing, with growing clarity, that his hesitation with Beatrice and his hesitation with Marisol were built from precisely the same avoidance, a specific, well-rehearsed story about respecting boundaries that had, in both cases, conveniently allowed him to avoid the harder, more vulnerable work of actually stepping forward. He found Beatrice at the café the following Tuesday morning, seated at her corner table for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, and understood, watching her from across the room, that Gus's earlier concern about her health had not been exaggerated. She looked considerably more frail than the version of her Theo now realized he had, in fact, glimpsed peripherally for 15 years without ever once fully registering her presence. He carried his coffee to her table and asked, quietly, if he could sit down. Beatrice looked up at him with an expression Theo found difficult to fully read. Surprise, certainly, but also something that looked, unexpectedly, like a specific, long-held anticipation finally arriving. "Gus told me," Theo said, sitting down across from her, "about the coffee, 15 years of it. I wanted to thank you properly, and I wanted to ask why, if you're willing to tell me." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her own cup. "I suppose it was always going to come out eventually," she said finally, her voice steady but carrying a specific weight. "I asked Gus to keep it private all these years because I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything. I still don't, if I'm honest, but I understand he's retiring, and I think some part of me is relieved the secret doesn't have to outlast someone who was never really supposed to be its only keeper." "Why me?" Theo asked. "Why did you start, all those years ago?" Beatrice considered this question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. "I saw something in you I recognized," she said finally. "Not the specifics. I didn't know your particular story back then, not the way I understand it a little better now, but I recognized the shame, the way you'd sit for hours some mornings, not ordering anything, trying to take up as little space as possible while still needing somewhere warm to exist. I recognized that specific posture because I'd worn it myself once, a very long time ago." "What happened to you?" Theo asked gently. Beatrice looked out the window for a moment before continuing. "I was 22, she said, a single mother, recently abandoned by my daughter's father, working 2 jobs that still didn't cover our expenses. There was a specific week, I don't need to give you every detail, where I genuinely didn't have enough money to feed both myself and my daughter properly, and I'd gone without eating for longer than I should have, trying to make sure she never noticed anything was wrong. I was sitting in a diner one evening, not ordering anything, just resting somewhere warm before I had to go back out into the cold, and a stranger, a man I never got his name, never saw again after that night, quietly told the waitress to bring me a full meal and paid for it before I even understood what was happening. He left before I could properly thank him. I spent years afterward trying to find some way to repay a kindness I never got the chance to actually acknowledge to the person who gave it." Theo felt his own eyes fill, understanding, with a specific ache, the full shape of what Beatrice was describing. "I decided, a long time ago, that since I could never repay him directly, I would simply keep passing it forward, quietly, whenever I noticed someone carrying that same specific shame I remembered so clearly," Beatrice continued. "You were the longest one I ever kept doing it for. Most of the others, over the years, needed it for a few weeks, maybe a few months, until their circumstances changed. You needed longer to fully rebuild. And then, once you didn't need it anymore in the practical sense, I kept doing it anyway, because it had become its own private thing by then. Not really about the coffee at all, but about honoring a debt I could never repay to the person who actually gave it to me." Theo sat with Beatrice for nearly an hour that morning, the two of them talking with a specific, unhurried openness that neither of them had expected when the conversation began. "I want to repay you somehow," Theo said, near the end of their conversation. "I don't know exactly how, but I don't think I can just accept this and walk away without trying to give something back." Beatrice shook her head slowly. "I don't want repayment," she said. "I've told you why. The moment it becomes a transaction, it stops being what it actually was. I'd rather you did something different with it, if you feel you need to do something at all." "What would that look like?" Theo asked. Beatrice considered this. "Pass it forward, the way I did," she said. "Find whoever's sitting in their own version of that corner table, carrying that same shame, and do something for them instead of for me. I think that's the only kind of repayment that actually honors what this was ever supposed to be." Theo thought, immediately, and with a specific clarity, of Marisol Reyes, the careful, professional distance he had been maintaining with her for months, telling himself it was respect rather than avoidance. He met with Marisol the following week, choosing, deliberately, to step past the careful professional boundary he had maintained for months, asking direct questions about her home situation that he had previously avoided, listening more fully than he had allowed himself to before. The conversation revealed circumstances considerably more serious than his careful notes had suggested, a home situation that required immediate intervention rather than the patient, distant monitoring Theo had been quietly telling himself was the appropriate professional approach. He arranged, within days, for Marisol to receive the kind of direct support she had actually needed for months, support Theo understood, with a specific clarity he hadn't possessed 2 weeks earlier. He had been withholding, not out of professional wisdom, but out of his own comfortable avoidance of the harder, more vulnerable work of genuinely stepping forward. "I think I understand something now that I didn't before," he told Priya that evening. Beatrice never let her kindness stay theoretical. She actually acted, every single day for 15 years, in a way that cost her something real and asked for nothing in return. "I've been telling myself, with Marisol, that careful distance was the same thing as genuine care. I don't think that's true. I think I've just been protecting myself from the discomfort of actually getting involved." Theo and Beatrice met regularly over the following months, the relationship settling into something considerably more direct than the anonymous, unspoken arrangement that had connected them for the preceding 15 years. An actual friendship built on honest conversation rather than careful distance. Theo learned, over these months, more of Beatrice's own history. Her daughter, now an adult living several states away, with whom Beatrice maintained a warm, if geographically distant relationship. Her decades of quiet, anonymous small kindnesses extended to dozens of strangers across a lifetime, most of whom, Theo understood, would likely never learn her name any more than he had for the first 15 years of receiving her gift. Gus's final week at Wren's arrived, and Theo made a point of being there on his last morning, standing beside Beatrice as the cafe's regular customers gathered to wish him well. "I want to do something," Theo told Beatrice, that same week, "to make sure this doesn't just end with you, or fade away once you're not able to keep doing it yourself. I've talked to the new owners. I'd like to set up a small account here. Nothing dramatic, nothing publicized, just enough to keep covering a coffee, quietly, for whoever the staff notices sitting too long without ordering anything. I'd like to call it something simple, maybe just the Corner Table Fund, so nobody outside the staff ever needs to know the specifics behind it." Beatrice's eyes filled at this, a specific, quiet emotion moving across her face. "I think that's exactly right," she said. "I think that's precisely what I would have wanted if I'd ever let myself imagine what happens to this after I'm no longer able to keep doing it." Beatrice's health continued its gradual decline over the following year, though she remained, for most of that time, capable of her regular morning visits to the café, sitting at her corner table with considerably more openness now than the careful anonymity she had maintained for the preceding 15 years. Theo visited her at home during the weeks her health made the café visits more difficult, bringing coffee to her instead, a small, quiet reversal of the ritual that had first connected them, though neither of them remarked on the symmetry directly, both simply understanding it without needing to name it aloud. "I never expected any of this," Beatrice told him, during one of these visits, sitting together in her small, orderly living room. 15 years of paying for a stranger's coffee, and I always assumed it would simply end quietly one day, without either of us ever really knowing each other. I never imagined it might become an actual friendship instead. I think that might be the best kind of repayment, Theo said. Better than anything I could have arranged deliberately. Just this, actually knowing you, instead of only ever being the person you were quietly taking care of from a careful distance. Beatrice reached over and took his hand, the gesture simple and unhurried. I think I understand now why I never wanted credit for it all those years, she said. I think some part of me was afraid that if you knew, and thanked me properly, it would somehow become smaller, reduced to a transaction, something owed and repaid, rather than what it actually was. I don't think I understood, until now, that it could become something even larger than what I originally intended. Something that outlasts the coffee, and outlasts me, and keeps going in a form I never could have planned for on my own. Ren's Café continued the corner table fund long after Beatrice's health made her visits impossible entirely. The small, quiet arrangement Theo had established becoming, over the following years, a permanent and mostly invisible fixture of the cafe's ordinary operations. New staff trained to simply watch for the specific, quiet signs of someone sitting too long without ordering, adding their coffee to the fund without ever making a spectacle of the gesture, exactly the way Beatrice had always done. Theo visited Beatrice regularly through the final months of her life, the two of them building, in that unexpectedly short window of actual friendship, something considerably deeper than either of them might have anticipated from a relationship that had begun as a 15-year secret neither party had ever intended to fully reveal. On the morning after Beatrice's funeral, Theo arrived at Ren's Café at his usual hour, ordered his usual coffee, and reached for his wallet out of habit. Already covered, the new barista said, sliding the cup across the counter. Exactly the way Gus once had, exactly the way Beatrice's original, careful instruction had specified 15 years earlier, and would apparently continue specifying for however long the café itself continued to exist. Theo looked toward the corner table by the window, empty now, permanently, in a way it had never quite been empty during all the years he had unknowingly shared that particular hour with a stranger who had chosen, quietly and at real personal cost, to notice him. He carried his coffee to that same corner table and sat down, understanding, with a specific and settled peace, that some kindnesses are never fully finished simply because the person who began them is gone, that a debt too large to ever repay directly can still, somehow, continue moving forward, indefinitely, through whoever chooses, at exactly the right unremarkable moment, to finally notice someone else carrying the same quiet shame Beatrice had once recognized so clearly in him. Some mornings, he thought, sitting alone at her table with his coffee slowly cooling in front of him, the most important thing anyone ever does for you is simply choose, day after day, without asking for anything in return, to keep showing up,